Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 163 on ecosystem engineers with Dr. Tom Smith of the University of Oxford. So it's been an awfully long time since our last interview, and I'm sure you all know where I've been, so it feels really good to be home and creating content again. Anyway, that is not important right now because we're back and we're trying to tackle what might be the hardest paleontological topic to convey in an audio format. But as you'll find out, computational paleontology is such a significant area that hardly ever gets discussed. So, with something as complex and conceptual as this, it can be really difficult to get your head around. So please take your time with the interview and remember that the images that we have on our website are the key to understanding this research. We also have a link to the full open access paper, so please make sure you visit paleocast.com. As we ramp up the recordings over the next couple of weeks, it'll be great to hear from you, our audience, as to which episodes you'd like to hear. So please drop in your requests anywhere you can and we'll see what we can do. As always, any help that you can give on social media to get this episode seen will be hugely appreciated. And a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts from would give us the best possible start to the year. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for coming on to the show today.
Glad to be here, Dave. How are you?
I am pretty good. It's good to be recording again. It's been a while. And also it's been a while since I've seen you. When was the last time I actually saw you in person? At Bristol?
Oh, crikey. It's going to be Bristol, yep. So that's taking it back a few years. I think maybe you were coming back into the office to pick up a big fossil that had been sitting on the side for a while. I'm not sure what was in it, but I just remember people describing it as Dave's slab.
Dave's slab.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know what that is, actually. Some fish heads or something like that.
I think so, yeah.
There were a lot of my fossils lying around the paleobiology department in Bristol. Like, there was, for a department that has, like how many people? 20, 30 paleontologists?
Maybe more at this point.
I was so surprised that there were so few fossils. Like, everyone's doing computational stuff. And I was the one running around with like giant slabs of rock that I just hauled back from somewhere in Wales.
It was a shame, really, because as one of these computational people, I wanted to live vicariously through people like you who actually work with fossils and get to touch fossils, but alas, not meant to be.
Well, I'll take you out fossil hunting one day.
I would enjoy that. I would like that.
Right. Anyway, we like to get to know you first before we start jumping into computational paleontology. So how did you get involved in the field of paleontology?
So my interest started, I think, with a lot of people of my generation, with walking with dinosaurs as a kid and watching that, being amazed by that, being enthralled by that. And then I spent my childhood thinking I was going to be a marine biologist, and I eventually went to do a degree at Southampton in marine biology. And at the end of my second year, I signed up to do some work in an evolutionary ecology lab there. And they had me poisoning shrimp with copper under pressure for an entire summer. Yeah, it's as bleak as it sounds. And by the end of the summer, having murdered hundreds of shrimp and frozen them in liquid nitrogen, I decided that marine biology wasn't for me. And fortunately, at the start of my third year, I had an option to take a course in paleobiology. So I took that on a whim, and the rest is history, really. I fell back in love with the subject, realized it was what I wanted to do, and managed to sort of finagle my way into a PhD at Bristol, and here I am.
Yeah, I like the pathway of like, this is too many dead shrimp. I'm gonna have to study dead animals.
Yeah, I don't want to be killing the animals myself. I want that stage to be done. I want to just deal with what's left. That's
many millions of years ago. Like, distance myself from the killing of the dead animals.
Exactly.
As part of my PhD, I was supposed to be killing scorpions and chopping them up, lots of different arachnids, and looking at their exoskeletons. And it bothered me so much, and I never actually managed to do it. I was looking at all different ways of around the issue because I just don't think I could have done it myself.
I completely understand.
Yeah, it's hard, and I was really surprised at how few regulations and restrictions there are on killing animals in such a way for science. And I understand why we do it for science. And, with something like shrimp, people eat prawns all the time. So but still, actually being the one to do it, I could never get my head around that.
It's pretty
So,
grim. It's pretty grim. I mean, I know the regulations are different for vertebrates and invertebrates, or at least I think they are. And I think that's why there was so little red tape between me, a second year student, and second year marine biology undergraduate student, and a pile of dead shrimp. But it was seamless, really. There was a lab introduction, and that was it.
yeah,
But yeah, it's important. I know. I mean, that work as well. I should stress it was towards understanding the impacts of deep sea mining, which at the time a bunch of companies had just been greenlit. They'd been apportioned sort of parts of the sea floor, so deep sea mining was going to go ahead, and nobody really had a clue as to how those
yeah,
ecosystems would respond. So it was for a good cause, or at least I
yeah, for
think it was
sure.
for a good cause. But it just, as you say, it doesn't really feel good. I think if you can avoid it, it feels better to.
Mm. And I remember like getting in touch with the university and saying like, okay, I'm going to have to do things with animals. And they were like, okay, you've got to do this course. You've got to come and see us. Let's work through all of your plans. This is really serious stuff. And I sat there, I did the courses. It took me ages. And eventually they came to it and they're like, okay, so which animals are you going to be using for your research? Is it dogs? Is it monkeys? Is it octopus because they're protected? And I was like, no, it's going to be scorpions. And they were like, oh, okay. Well, that's fine. Yeah, just go on.
Wow.
So yeah, the really there is no red tape like you would expect. But anyway, we have somewhat got sidetracked
We have. I'm sorry about that.
in an amusing way. Not an amusing, in an interesting way.
Interesting, definitely.
Insights into what it's like being a paleontologist. But those days are behind you, so you're not using uh, live animals or dead animals. You are not hauling around slabs of rock, but you're
Nope.
doing more methodological data stuff. Um, is that what kind of paleontologist you are? Are you asking questions of the fossil record?
I think so. At least at this point, I've resigned myself to my fate as a computational paleobiologist, and it does come with benefits. Like it's a nice, comfy office and a fairly practical uh, career choice. But I also find it really interesting because it is you're able to ask, I think, the broadest sorts of questions and benefit from the fact that there's lots of really talented, great people out there who are producing amazing data sets and raw data that is being pooled and collected in databases that we can all access now. So I feel like it's the right time to be this sort of paleobiologist, or at least this sort of paleobiologist with my sorts of interests.
Yeah. And what do you do outside of paleontology?
So, for those who know me, it won't be a surprise to say I'm absolutely obsessed with American football. Just to make
Oh,
it
really?
difficult. Yeah, I can't watch it at normal times because all the games kick off at sort of 6 p.m. onwards on a Sunday. So, for those of you who've seen me on a Monday, if anyone listening has seen me on a Monday, you'll know I'm usually really exhausted because I've stayed up really late watching the game. But I really, really enjoy American football, and that kind of absorbs most of my spare time trying to catch up on that. I like to run as sort of my exercise of choice. Although, admittedly, I'm getting a little bit lazy as I get older. But yeah, that's really that kind of absorbs me quite happily. I'm a bit of a gamer, but I'm finding increasingly less time for that at the moment. But that's me, really.
Okay. And the majority of our audience are American. So here's something for them. Who are your team?
Oh, I'm gonna people are gonna switch it off now. I am a Chiefs fan. and I recognize that that probably paints me as a glory hunter. All I can say is that I started supporting them before they won their first Super Bowl with Patrick Mahomes. My first season was the first season they won a Super Bowl with Pat, and I started watching 3 games in, and it was a really fun year because they had a fantastic offense and a terrible defense. So watching the game just as a casual observer, I really liked those games because there were lots of points. And so that's how I ended up as a Chiefs fan. And it's been a good few years to be a Chiefs fan. But I am the villain in my circle of friends that watch this as a result.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, oh,
Not a
the
clue.
Chiefs have been really good and
Yeah.
insufferably good, actually. So I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say they're sort of it's imagine if you I think the only comparison I can make for non-Americans is the Alex Ferguson era of Manchester United. That sort of dominance over a really long period of time.
Mm,
That's sort of where the Chiefs are heading and where they've been over the last 5 or 6 years.
yeah.
Um, so
I'm a
I,
Manchester
I
United fan, by the way.
Oh, there you
Um,
go. So you
I,
you remember the golden age.
I do, yeah. I could walk to the stadium in the length of this episode. So, yeah, yes. Also, I'm not a glory hunter either. So we've both
No,
been very fortunate in our choice of teams. Anyway,
look,
my next question is: could you see your career going off on any tangents? However, given the tangents that we already have been on today, I'm guessing maybe.
yes, yeah. I've genuinely thought about whether a career in sort of sports analytics would be viable.
Whoa.
Uh, as not a front of us. I have no desire to be in front of a camera, but someone behind, someone crunching data. A sport like the NFL is very data rich. As is the case, I think with most American sports, there's loads and loads of analytics and metrics associated with them, and I would that would appeal to me. Beyond that, I haven't really given it much thought.
Well, there's a lot of transferable skills, surely, aren't there?
That's what I'm thinking. It's I'm a computational paleobiologist. I've got a fairly good grasp of statistics, or at least a reasonable grasp of statistics. And I like to play with data, and I feel like that maybe one day opens a door, which would be an interesting one to walk through.
And if anyone wants to watch Moneyball, that is a great film
Oh,
about this exact subject. And we
yes.
are speaking to the real life Jonah Hill here.
I I wish. I wish that. Oh, it's such a good film. That tickles me in so many ways.
Right. Anyway, we're not talking about sport.
No.
Well, we shouldn't be talking about sport. We're going to be talking about ecosystem engineers. And so you've had a recent paper where you've
Mhm.
modeled the impact of the introduction of ecosystem engineers to an ecosystem. Uh, can you first explain to us what an ecosystem engineer is in a single sentence?
Yes. So there's lots of different definitions, but to me and to my colleagues, an ecosystem engineer is an organism that alters the resources available to other organisms in a system.
Okay. So, what are the things in an ecosystem that could be affected by the actions of an organism?
So it they really can be any of the variables, biotic or abiotic. So, something as simple as food availability or nutrient availability, that's a really sort of obvious one, but you could have more complex things like the physical makeup of the habitat or the system. It's really anything that can vary can be a variable that is engineered.
Okay, so as an example, could you give us?
Oh yes, yeah. So I think the really obvious example that people go to are beavers and beaver dams, because these will affect the courses of the rivers and ultimately change the distribution of habitats in the local area. So that's sort of that's a structural change to the environment. You can also have anything that kind of interacts with biogeochemical cycling. So, detritivores are really obvious examples of ecosystem engineers, especially if they're introduced into new habitats. So that can be another mode of ecosystem engineering, so to speak.
Okay. Is there a different way of classifying them based on how they affect their ecosystem if there's all these different ways that they can do it?
You'd think, but it's really difficult to kind of come up with like a clean break or a clean classification system.
Mm,
The one that we landed on, or at least the one that we found works fairly well, is the distinction between autogenic and allergenic engineers. So autogenic engineers modify their environments with their bodies. So the best example for that, in my opinion, is sort of mussels smothering a lake bed or a coast, some sea floor where they just completely smother the benthos with their bodies. They aggregate and form these carpets effectively and just completely change the environment that way. Allergenic engineers actually modify their environment directly. So instead of using their bodies, they do stuff to the environment. So again, we come back to the beaver example. They build dams. This changes the environment. We found that kind of works, or at least that sticks, and that's fairly intuitive. There are other classification schemes out there, but they're all continuum, or at least they operate over continuum. So they don't really they're not really as useful when it comes to binning different types of ecosystem engineers. But there are, as I should stress, there's lots of them out there, and different people do use different schemes. But we just haven't this is the only one that we landed on as a satisfying one.
okay. There is a benefit to beaver dams to the ecosystem in many ways. There's also drawbacks to that. Is ecosystem engineering always a positive or a negative? Can it be both depending on what is affected? Can it ever be simple enough to look at them and say this is a positive or a negative to the ecosystem?
I think it's all about perspective, really. Most cases, I would say both. There will be some faunas that are or floras that are detrimentally impacted by ecosystem engineers. They will suffer as a result of the changing environment, and then there will be others that benefit it. I mean, I think one thing that ecosystem engineers tend to do quite consistently is they tend to act as pioneer species, sort of opening the door for invasive species to move in or new species to move into ecosystems. So, from the perspective of something moving into a system or trying to establish itself in a system, it's a bet that they tend to be quite beneficial. But on the flip side, if you are an established member of an ecosystem and an engineer enters and starts changing things, you're probably viewing them, or they're probably best perceived as a negative impact. So it's really about perspective, and they're rarely simple. That's the sad thing. I think they're always going to be complex. They're always going to be sort of at the center of complex networks of
Mm.
interactions.
Okay, here's a bonus question that's not been scripted. Do we often think of ecosystems as a static and well defined thing? Or should it be the case that we look at them as like an evolving thing, something that constantly is changing?
I think that's a really good question. Um, I think we have a tendency in a lot of areas of paleobiology to view things as static and sort of take a freeze a system effectively and just change one variable or study the
Mm.
impact of one specific variable over a period of time, assuming the rest of the system is the same. And with ecosystems, obviously, they're always going to change. The abundances of the constituent members of an ecosystem are going to change throughout, and they're going to fluctuate throughout, and that's going to affect the flows of resources between different levels of a system and different parts of a system. So they should be viewed as fluid. The core structure is probably going to be fairly stable, but the actual size of the fluxes between constituent parts, that's something that I think is inherently going to have variance to it. I guess over a period of time, if there's no kind of introduction of new parts to an ecosystem, you could presume that it's going to average out and be fairly stable. But I think there's probably a lot to be gained from considering the fluidity of ecosystems, or at least sort of the transient nature of some of the parts within them.
So, is there also a question of scale in this? So, how big does an ecosystem have to be before it can be classified as engineered? I mean, I can go out into the garden and throw a load of salt into the flower bed. Is that engineering that tiny little ecosystem? Or do I have to like change a whole region?
I think that's a really good question. And again, it comes back to the fact that there's no concrete definition of what constitutes an ecosystem engineer. There's no kind of cutoff line. And so it's about how you define them. There are some people that argue that all organisms are ecosystem engineers because they modify their environments in some way at some scale. And
Mm.
so, from their perspective, everything is an engineer because even just going outside and stepping on the lawn is going to minimally impact that little footprint
Yeah, you're
of lawn.
respiring. You're
Exactly.
changing the atmosphere with your breath and the
Yeah.
heat of your body. The space that you occupy is space that something else can't have.
This is it. I think um, now for something to pick up, something to sort of leave a record in the fossil record, something to leave an impression on the fossil record, you would expect it to have to be, a more protracted, more substantial sort of engineering behavior or process. So, maybe there's when it comes to living faunas and the modern biosphere, there really is no cutoff for how small something is before we say, oh, it's no longer engineering. But maybe we need to have a stricter definition or require a bit more of a substantial impact when we're thinking about geological examples of ecosystem engineering. But it's a good question. There's no real at the moment. I don't think there's any sort of consensus on it. There tends to be just I guess a bit of a gut feeling, which there's probably some people out there who have actually thought about this in greater detail in terms of what actually is the cutoff, but it doesn't seem to be established as far as I'm concerned.
And how quickly does this impact need to occur? Could it potentially be something that happens over millions of years as opposed to like years or decades or generations, however long that may be?
So I think this is a big question. Again, it's probably about where what sort of system you're studying, about where you're studying it, and for how long. If we're looking at the fossil record and we're trying to tease out evidence of ecosystem engineering from the fossil record, it probably does need to be a protracted episode of engineering. It does need to take hundreds of years, thousands of years, ideally millions of years, for it to stick and to leave a footprint that we can find. But in modern systems, it probably doesn't need to be all that longer an impact. It probably can, be something that operates over a couple of days.
Are certain kinds of organisms more likely to be ecosystem engineers than others? And so, what I'm thinking about here are things like elephants and mastodon mammoths and how they completely change their ecosystems. Like, I think the savannas may be only there because of the impact of elephants in long terms. Is it large animals? Is it those with a giant biomass in total? So things like the mussels in the lakes in Canada, was it?
Yeah. I think in the Great Lakes in America, they're
Oh,
they're, they're a
sorry.
big problem actually. I think it's either quagga or zebra mussels. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But yeah, I think that's a really good question, and there might be people out there with better answers than me. But I think biomass is definitely something that could be impactful, or at least sort of like something that defines
Mm.
a better candidate for ecosystem engineering. I think the thing that I landed on, or at least the property that I landed on, was organisms that have got a really broad dispersal range or a really broad geographic range. I think organisms that have got the greatest potential to be invasive species, I think, are probably those that are most likely to be ecosystem engineers. So again, this comes back to the mussels, but it could be anything that does broadcast spawn in marine environments. Anything with sort of a marine larval stage that just gets swept along by the currents and deposited. I feel like those sorts of organisms are well equipped to radiate into new environments that they didn't previously occupy and start engineering them and modifying them. So, but again, I don't think there's any sort of hard and fast rule for this. I think you have to sort of work through the logic. And again, most animals are going to end up with some potential, but yeah, I think large organisms have got the potential simply to leave a bigger impact over a short period of time. And then those with the bigger geographic ranges and bigger dispersal ranges might be able to do quite well as well.
Are there any modern examples of ecosystem engineers that you could give us? One that I'm going to come up with are bees. They have a huge impact on their environment, don't
Yeah,
they?
yeah,
Ecosystem.
they definitely do. They definitely do. Now, um, I think the thing with it is, with the thing to bear in mind is it's about kind of altering the resources available, and bees, I feel like, are constituent parts of their ecosystems, and maybe
Ah,
don't necessarily. So maybe they're I the I see this is where the definition, it gets really hard to disentangle engineering from just sort of regular participation in an ecosystem. But I think, I guess the abundance of bees is going to affect the fluxes of a lot of biogeochemical in a lot of biogeochemical cycles. So
hmm,
maybe. I think the one that I always go to are earthworms, because they're a really sort of easy, low-hanging fruit, and they're a really nice example of them being good in some systems, or sort of positive positive members of some ecosystems, and then detrimental in others. So they're native to Europe and Asia. So in our soil ecosystems, they're great. They're a fundamental part of soil biogeochemical cycling. But in North America, they're actually a bit of a pest ecosystem engineer, because they were introduced sometime after the last ice age. And there's now a real chance that they're going to drive sugar maples to extinction, which is, terrifying news for anyone who loves maple syrup.
mm,
Um, but it's because sugar maples rely on dense leaf litter to keep their roots moist. Um, and earthworms process that material. They break it down. So sugar maple roots, which are relatively shallow, from what I understand, at least this is the current thinking. There might be other things that come up. We might find out later on that this is total nonsense. But I think the current thinking is that earthworms are breaking down and processing the leaf litter that would be otherwise protecting sugar maple root systems from drying out. And as a result, sugar maple forests across North America are suffering badly as a consequence of the engineering effect of earthworms. So I think they're a really, really good example of a modern ecosystem engineer being good in some systems and bad in others.
so would it only should we only think about ecosystem engineers in relation to some change that's occurred? Because we've just spoken about bees being an integral part that supports an ecosystem. At some point there had to be the impact that bees had on their ecosystem, which would have been an
Absolutely.
engineering event. Afterwards, they're established within that ecosystem that they have created, and they're no longer the ecosystem engineer like millions of years down the line. They're just the integral part of that system they've made.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. You kind of, the engineer, it's almost like a human engineer comes in and builds a structure, and they might be kept around to maintain the structure, but they're not adding to it. They're not changing it any further. Uh, and I guess sort of bees are like that. Bees once were these very, very effective ecosystem engineers, and they might be in ways that we're not thinking about right now, but in terms of their sort of role in the pollination of plants, and as such the carbon cycle, the global carbon cycle, they've kind of established their role at this point. So they're sort of maintainers, members of the ecosystem, rather than these insurgent engineers.
Okay, excellent. I think I've got a good grasp on it now. Um, so then, wait, are we ecosystem engineers as people, as humans?
Definitely, definitely. I think we're having an impact that you wouldn't normally see, unless we're looking at geological timescales. So I feel we are most definitely ecosystem engineers. Deforestation is the obvious one, but just changes in land use that is probably the biggest source of engineering in this modern world that we live in.
Oh,
Or at
for
least
sure.
to my mind, yeah.
Yeah. Pesticides,
Yep.
agriculture,
Yep.
cities, everything.
All of it. Concrete jungles, the lot.
Okay. Speaking about huge impact of ecosystem engineers, can we see their impact throughout history? And if so, what have been some of the most significant ecosystem engineering events?
So that's a really good question because there are a couple of events that we're pretty damn sure affected were ecosystem engineering events and affected the trajectory of life as we know it. But in terms of actually quantifying those effects, it's really quite hard to do so. So the Great Oxygenation Event is the sort of the low-hanging fruit here. The evolution, associated with the evolution of photosystems in cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria are the engineers in this case, and they just made the Earth infinitely more hospitable to life by filling the atmosphere with oxygen, 2 billion years ago, 2.5 billion years ago, somewhere around that time. So that's a really obvious example. We don't actually have, numbers for the impact of biodiversity at that point, but we can look at the modern biodiversity and say, okay, well, all of this stems from that. So that's a really, that's almost a unique case in a sense, because that engineering event facilitated modern biodiversity and diversification.
Thanks,
Um,
cyanobacteria.
Yeah, thank you. Um, we can dedicate this podcast to you. Uh, and then I think the next big event is probably the Ediacara and Cambrian transition. At least, I'm thinking, with my animal focused brain, because over this period we see the evolution of burrowing, pumping, and swimming, and effectively they took the environment that organisms were living in, which was mostly just these microbial maps. There were these two-dimensional microbial maps, and they made them multidimensional. They gave them the ability to go down. Gave organisms the ability to swim up in the water column, and that had a huge impact on biogeochemical cycling. So I think that's probably the next big event. And again, we don't have sort of a quantitative view of this, but qualitatively, it had to have had um, a significant impact and is a significant episode of ecosystem engineering. So those are kind of the two that really jump out to me as I guess the sort of the on the broadest possible scale had the biggest impact.
Okay, and is it possible to see it on the smaller scale? So we've been talking about invasive species, for example. Surely something like you've got species A, and then all of a sudden, species B comes along, and the whole associated assemblages change. Is it possible to like see that change and then have that causality and imply, an ecosystem has been engineered?
I think the best example of that is the appearance of reef building organisms in the fossil record, because once an environment develops a reefal component, or once evidence of a reef appears in an environment, not only does the composition of the fauna change, but just the extent of it changes, the diversity of it changes. So, you know, sponges, cnidarians, annelids, and mollusks all have had episodes as reef builders through geological history. They have all evolved reef building characteristics. And
Hmm.
so I think, in terms of a spatio-temporal scale, they're probably the smallest possible scale that we can go to in terms of impact and still register it in the fossil record with some confidence. So yeah, I think probably reef building organisms, and then beyond that, it gets very tricky.
Yeah, I love that in your paper when I was sat there reading it, and you said exactly that about the four different groups that have like created reefs, and I thought that's a really interesting point and is something that doesn't get appreciated enough. It's not just the corals that
Yeah,
we know today, but like worms and archaeocyaths and things that you don't know. Bivalves making coral reefs. It's crazy.
it's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. And they all tend to support, or at least anecdotally, it looks like these reefs all support elevated levels of species richness, or genetic richness. I know that there's work ongoing on at this at the moment, so hopefully over the next year or so, we're going to get a better idea of exactly what happens. But all of these different sorts of reef building organisms seem to have a similar effect on the local diversity.
Mm. Okay, so conversely, is there a risk that any change in the fossil record, this species disappears, this species appears, there's a change of an assemblage of fossils, that ecosystem engineering could be implied for that event, any change that we see, ecosystem engineering?
I think so. I think it's a powerful explanation for a lot of phenomena, but I think there's a risk, and there is always a risk, I think, with anything like this, where it could be used as a broad brush fix all, really, for
Mm.
if you've got a gap in your understanding of a system. Oh, well, an engineer did this. And so it's a challenging sort of tightrope to walk. And I think you just have to be very careful with what you suggest, because there isn't really a great deal of quantitative evidence of the impact of engineers in the fossil record. We don't know how much of a footprint they leave. So you're absolutely right. There is a risk at this, and it's something we have to be very wary of.
Yeah. So, what other questions like that need answering about ecosystem engineering and our view of it in the fossil record?
I think the big one for me is, for how long does an engineering behavior have to take place for it to leave a footprint in the fossil record? If we can figure that out or constrain that problem, then we can probably cross out a number of engineering behaviors as potential drivers of patterns that we see in the fossil record, and we can sort of bring our attention and our focus to those behaviors that can drive changes that would be recorded in the fossil record. So that's the big question I think that we should focus on, and then just whether there are significant differences between different types of ecosystem engineering behaviors, and whether these could be categorized. Coming back to sort of one of your earlier questions, can we differentiate between these different types of engineering behaviors? Do they all have common effects? Are there any general patterns? There's a huge amount of work to be done, which is why it's a really exciting topic to dig into.
Yeah, like you said at the start, when we were talking about what kind of a paleontologist are you and why, this is the kind of stuff that data-led paleontology can answer, and it is so fascinating. And just having spoken through everything, then it the impact of it is just so significant, and understanding this kind of phenomenon and how it all works, the mechanics behind it, is just absolutely fundamental to understanding the world, biology, everything. It's incredible, incredibly complex and incredibly difficult. There's so much stuff that actually feeds into this, and everything's integrated, and God, it sounds complicated. So let's try and model it,
Yeah.
which is what you did. So what were you trying to do?
So we were just trying to see if ecosystem engineering behavior modeled on an individual level could leave a impression on a pattern observed at the species level. We were just trying to see if we could pick up fluctuations in diversification dynamics as a result of ecosystem engineering processes operating at, between individuals. So we're trying to see, we wanted to take the first steps towards understanding what is the limit of what can be detected in the fossil record. But because it's really hard to work with empirical data, and really hard to collect the kind of data that you need for this, we decided that, we'll just build a simulation and and see if that works instead.
So how did the simulation work? How is it built? And
So,
what role did Joe Keating play in this as well? Because
oh,
Joe Keating, formerly of this stable.
so Joe Keating is ultimately responsible for all of this. I just want to blame him for everything that is about to follow. Him and Russell Garwood and a few other people have worked really hard on TrevoSim, which is the software that we used. It's an individual level simulator that it isn't really spatially explicit, so it has no concept of space, but it does consider time, and it's a pretty nifty bit of kit. But yeah, Joe Keating, absolutely to blame for what's about to follow.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so how does it all work?
So, in a nutshell, TrevoSim, you start with a an environment, a single environment, or you can specify multiple ones, but for this example, I'm just going to say a single environment, and you define the environment with a couple of strings of zeros and ones. And these we call masks in TrivoSim, but the best way to think about these is each of them represent maybe a variable that if an organism lines up perfectly with, is perfectly adapted to take advantage of that variable. Russell Garwood is probably shuddering at this analogy, but please bear with me, Russell. So we define environments with a series of masks. So the more binary strings that an organism needs to try and line up with, more variables it needs to try and take advantage of, the more complex the environment. So in this example, let's just choose one. Let's keep it really simple. So we have an environment with a single variable that an organism needs to try and match to. The organisms in this environment are defined with binary genomes, just like the masks are defined with binary genomes or binary sequences. This means it is possible for an organism to have a genome that perfectly matches one-to-one the sequence of numbers that define the environment. If it does that, according to the definition of fitness we use in the environment, the organism as fit as can be. It is perfectly adapted to this environment. Now, if you've got multiple masks in the environment, multiple variables an organism needs to sort of adapt to exploit, then it's obviously going to be impossible for it to match all of them perfectly. And so it isn't going to have this perfect fitness. And this is how we ran the system. We ran the system with 3 masks. So each environment had 3 variables that the organism needed to try and balance its adaptation between. The way the actual simulation works is you start with an environment filled or a playing field, as it's called in the TrivoSim lingo. The playing field is filled with individuals that all belong to the same species. They all have the same genome, which is randomly generated. So it's a random sequence of zeros and ones. And the environment has some totally random masks. The way the simulation is structured is that while the number of species is less than the limit to the field, which is something you can define and you can set, individuals will be ordered in terms of their fitness. So the fittest organisms are put to the top of the list, so they're brought to the front of a queue. The most unfit organisms are thrown to the back of the queue. And then the simulation will work its way along the queue and flip a coin for each individual. Once a coin toss lands on heads, that individual is replicated, or duplicated, and then its genome mutates. So what this does in effect is it gives the fitter organisms a greater probability of duplicating, reproducing, and gives them a greater probability of mutating and eventually speciating. If the mutation takes the distance, which is measured as the Hamming distance between the new duplicate, the daughter individual, if the distance between that and its parent exceeds a specified difference, we specified sort of 10, a Hamming distance of 10, then that new duplicate is assigned as a new species. To make room for it, you then return that duplicate to the playing field and you overwrite the least fit organisms. The one at the back of the queue gets thrown out. So it hasn't got a spatial component, but it has got this component, this idea of fitness, this concept of fitness based on Hamming distances. I hope that made sense. I hope I didn't totally butcher it, but that's how TrivoSim sort of works in a nutshell. It runs over iterations. This process is looped again and again and again until you reach the end of the end of the run. And then you can run it any number of times and you'll have a distribution of results that constrain the range of outcomes of your system by the end of the process.
Right, let's work through an example then. So you are working with the environment and the organisms. The environment you're calling masks. So the environment is a random set of binary numbers, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, whatever. And the organisms are similar, a random 0, 1, 1, 1. The organisms that are closest match to the environment, the 2 sets of numbers. The closer you are, the more likely it is that you will reproduce.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then when there is a production, there's also a mutation that's put in there of the number. And then as that develops over time, the organisms eventually will start getting closer, better adapted to each of the different uh, environments, the different masks.
Pretty much, yeah. They end up converging on the average. So if you have an environment that's defined by one mask, they'll converge on just whatever that mask is. But if you have an environment that's got multiple masks to it, multiple variables that need to be sort of that they're adapting towards, they'll end up working their way towards the average of the three eventually, or at least the average, the fitness that is possible given the differences between the three different variables. So you can make a system more or less complex. But that's how it works.
That's interesting. I don't know if this is something that I'm not understanding or is something that we'll cut out, but I would have thought that if you've got multiple different environments, that the organisms would self-sort themselves into the different bins, like the different environments. You'd get closer to one as opposed to the other, rather than an average between the two.
It's so what tends to happen is that you tend to end up, the more masks you add to an environment, the more complex you make it, the more
Oh,
peaks and
sorry.
troughs.
I think I understand that it. I'm thinking of it as like three individual environments as
Oh
opposed
yeah,
to three different factors within a single environment.
sorry, that's on me for not explaining it properly. Yeah, it's three individual masks or three kind of variables all within a single environment, and all the organisms are having to consider their fitness is being calculated considering all three of those masks at a time rather than three independent
Oh,
ones.
okay. So it'd be something like light, oxygen, and nutrient
Yeah, yeah,
availability.
yeah. That could be a good that would be a good sort of analogy to use.
Got it.
You can kind of it's all totally abstracted. That's the benefit of this system. So providing you don't overstep and start saying that you've solved the evolution of life, you can kind of apply it to any problem.
Oh, that's the next one. Try and figure
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. That one's that one's in that was in prep. We'll get there eventually.
Okay, got it. So, yeah, I can see how these organisms evolve. I can see how they would, yeah, get adapted to the environment and the different masks that are influencing the ecosystem that they're inhabiting. So, when does the ecosystem engineering come into play in this?
So this is kind of the new feature that we added to TrevoSim for this study. So previously, the masks had a probability of changing, of mutating themselves. So they did subtly change throughout the process of the simulation, which, as you can imagine, would sort of affect the fitness surface that these organisms were evolving along. It would change the positions of the fitness peaks and the fitness troughs. But what we did is we introduced this feature, and we actually introduced two flavors where halfway through a simulation, an individual could be designated as an ecosystem engineer. And that could either mean that its genome was added to the environment as an additional mask, therefore enhancing its fitness because it now matches perfectly one of the masks in the system, or its genome overwrote one of the masks already in place. So we had, in our simulations, we started with three masks, and in the runs where we added a mask, it went up to four halfway through the simulation, with the mask um, being taken from the genome of this designated engineer, or it overwrote it. And we added a little bit more variability into this, where we said, okay, we can have these sort of one-shot engineering events where halfway through a simulation, an organism which is designated as an engineer uh, overwrites a mask or adds a mask, and that's it. That mask then evolves randomly as with the rest of the masks throughout the rest of the simulation. Or every 500 iterations or so, at least I think it's 500. Oh, no, I'm forgetting. Um, every 500, yes, 500 iterations or so, um, the mask is overwritten again. So if the mask was added initially, that fourth mask, 500 iterations later, that fourth mask would be overwritten by the genome of the ecosystem engineer again. So it would kind of keep bringing it into alignment with the genome of the engineers.
Mm.
Um, if it was originally overwritten, it would be just the same genome that was over the same mask that was overwritten by the genome. So that was those were the sort of two models that we added, and the way that we kind of conceptualized this is that um, the adding of the mask is kind of like the opening of a new dimension. So the example that we kind of kept in mind while we were doing this study was the Ediacaran Cambrian transition, and how burrowing simply just adds another dimension to the environment, and swimming just adds another dimension to the environment. So we thought adding a mask kind of approximated this sort of added dimensionality to the fitness landscape, whereas overwriting the mask was more of a modification of an existing variable, like the modification of an existing resource and its availability. So again, it's all totally abstract, and it's about how you logically want to apply it. You could probably argue, different ways around, but that's how we conceptualized it, and that's ultimately how we implemented it.
Yeah. So if you had the organism selected to be an ecosystem engineer, and then you add it as a mask, it is telling the system, okay, this organism is now an additional element within the ecosystem, and all the
Effectively.
yeah and the ecosystem now has a extra dimension to which everything else can evolve towards, is having an influence on everything. And then if you keep on changing that mask to match the organism as that evolves, that is saying to the simulation that the organism is, because it's the same. No, it adds a dimension, and then the other one is that the organism is the environment.
It's one of those things. Yeah, they basically have the same effect after that initial introduction, like because they're just changing the environment again. But it's
Mm,
that the one is changing a new a new sort of. It basically has made the environment more complex, and then it keeps changing how it's made the environment more
that's
complex
it.
throughout the system. Whereas the other one hasn't made the environment more complex. It's just because it hasn't added this additional mask. Um, it's just changing the system to sort of suit its needs effectively.
There we go. Thank you for making that clear, because I was.
I hope I mean, I'm trying to. I'm conscious of using words like complex because in certain, complexity, I guess, it has a very specific definition. So I might also be just using words that are taboo, but uh, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, one is saying, okay, we've added complexity to the environment. The other one is that the organism is now the environment mask.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. This is why you need a PhD and need to work at Oxford to do this kind of stuff.
Oh God.
It's so conceptually, this is why I wanted to do this interview, because getting your head around it and understanding the importance of ecosystem engineering, and at the same time how difficult it is to simulate, and
Yeah.
it's a challenge, and that's why I wanted to do this. So I think we're there. Everyone's going to have to listen to it a few times over, but
Yeah. This
I
is
think
this is one of those where you spend an afternoon.
read the paper, everyone. So, did your environments and your organisms, they evolved at the same rate?
Yes, we had the same sort of rate of same probability of mutation of environment and organism. So they were evolving at the same rate throughout the simulation.
Mhm. And then, how many times did you run it? How many
So
iterations?
the
Not,
run was
not
we had 50.
iterations. Sorry,
No iterations. No, that's fine. That's
is
fine.
that the right
Iteration.
terminology?
So one run had 15,000 iterations. So 15,000 of these loops that I've mentioned, where it's ordering the organisms, the individuals based on their fitness and working its way through the queue until it finds one that duplicates. It's got 15,000 of those iterations, and we ran 1,000 for each sort of setup. So we had a baseline run without any ecosystem engineering, just to see, what happened. And then we had our sort of one-shot engineers, which we ran a thousand runs of, where we designated an individual as an ecosystem engineer at the halfway point, and then that was that. And then we had 1,000 runs of the persistent ecosystem engineering, where we designated an individual at the halfway point, and then every 500 iterations, it modified the mask again to match its genome. One thing I should add as well is that the descendants of these individuals would also carry the designation as ecosystem engineer, just to sort of like track their success relative to the non-ecosystem engineers that are their contemporaries.
Okay, so what did your results show? And the way that I would intuitively look at it is that if you throw off the balance of the simulation by introducing an ecosystem engineer, then that ecosystem engineer is perfectly adapted, and all of its descendants are going to have such a ridiculously massive evolutionary advantage over other organisms that when that organism mutates, and it only needs 10 steps to be considered another species, that still presumably is going to be so much closer to this mask than any of the other organisms that it'll just dominate, surely.
So that was actually our kind of thinking of what was going to happen going in. That's what we thought might happen. So we were a bit surprised with the result that we got. So I guess for context, when we analyzed our baseline runs, so these runs without any ecosystem engineering, we found that if we randomly selected a lineage at the halfway point, kind of as we designated an ecosystem engineer and just sort of tracked whether it survived until the end or not, we found that in over 97% of the runs, that individual lineage, that species just went extinct. So it didn't survive until the end. And it had a 0.7% chance of surviving until the end. And it had a 1.9% chance of not only surviving, but of its descendants representing the entire assemblage at the end of the run. So that it was the only lineage that was represented at the very end. Its descendants were the entirety of the playing field. So to contrast that, when we implemented the one-shot engineering, so just one and done at the halfway point, we didn't really see much of a difference. There was a tiny, tiny drop in the probability of a sort of contemporary non-engineer selected at the halfway point surviving until the end. So the non-engineers suffered a little bit, and the actual ecosystem engineering lineage had a slightly higher probability of, or in a percentage of runs, there was a slightly higher percentage of runs where they survived until the end and went on to dominate, but it was in the order of a percent difference. It was only when we implemented ecosystem engineering at the halfway point and then made the effect persistent throughout the rest of the simulation that we actually saw a significant difference. But even then, it wasn't 100%. So in these runs, we found that in 68.3% of them, so 683 of the 1,000 runs, we found that all the lineages, all the individuals we sampled at the end of the simulation were descended from this ecosystem engineer. So that's nearly 70% of cases, the ecosystem engineer went on to dominate the whole system. However, in 2.6%, they were just one of the survivors. There were other non-engineers present. And then in 29.1% of them, we found that they'd gone extinct entirely. So we were actually really encouraged by this, because it showed that the system isn't deterministic. It isn't just a case of you implement ecosystem engineering and they go on to dominate and that's the end of the story. So to us, it made the system actually maybe a bit more applicable and maybe a bit more realistic, because I don't know about you, I'm scared whenever I get 100% confidence in the result. If
Yes.
you know what I mean? When you get a p-value that has so many zeros, it's off the chart and it just says p equals 0. It's like, I don't believe this. But that's where we ended up. Those were the kind of main results that we found. We found this For the most part, engineering was very, being an ecosystem engineer was very advantageous to the survival of that lineage, but it wasn't a sure thing that it would survive until the end of the run.
Okay, can we put the table on our website?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a
Also,
really
that'll
useful.
help.
We're very proud of our figures as well. I should say. We spent far too
We
much
do
time
all that
tinkering with the
running
color scheme. Oh yeah. We spent far too much time working on the color scheme for our figures. So please use them.
and look at the pretty colors. Yeah, they are pretty nice. It's a good choice.
We were happy to match them throughout the paper. That's what we were proudest of.
So, what was the impact of when you modified an environment versus adding a new one?
So this is probably an artifact of our simulations being quite similar after the fact. In what I said earlier, where after the mask was added, it was modified in the same way that the other form of ecosystem engineering just modified one of the existing masks. But we didn't really find any difference between the two systems. Now, I think we would find quite a significant difference if we continued to add masks every 500 iterations rather than just modify one over and over again. And that might be an interesting follow-up to this study. But we didn't really find any significant differences between the two, which, as I say, probably a reflection of them being quite similar after the initial introduction of an ecosystem engineer.
How did the simulation look immediately after you had an ecosystem engineering event? So when you change the simulation, do you just get the change and then it sticks throughout the rest of the simulation, or does it average out over time? Does it invariably change afterwards? Is there a seismic change that then tails out, or is it a seismic change that then sticks? How does it go?
So it's a bit different between the two modes of engineering, actually. So with the one-shot event, at least looking kind of from a rates perspective, we saw an initial spike in speciation associated with the engineering event, and then a lot of noise after that, where speciation rate was still elevated relative to the norm, or relative to what it was before the engineering event, but it calmed down a few thousand iterations after, and sort of reached that norm again by the end of the simulation. The extinction rate also showed a spike, but this was delayed, which I guess sort of makes sense in the way you have this kind of big pulse in speciation, and then it's followed by extinction as individuals are winnowed out to make room for this these new fitter engineering organisms. With the persistent engineering, what we saw pulses of extinction and speciation in association with the engineering events as they were continually applied. So that kind of makes sense, is that every time the organisms modified their environments, they introduced a signal of speciation and extinction into the resulting data set of into the resulting trees. So we were pretty encouraged by that in terms of how that might be visible in an empirical data set. That's exciting to us because we're seeing, results at the species level reflecting dynamics at the individual level. But this is a very abstract study and a very, very small constrained one. There's a lot more that we need to do before we can start making those kind of claims.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question. Did when you make a giant change to the ecosystem, you see a pulse of speciation that's followed by a pulse of extinction after a while? Like, could that pattern also be seen in the fossil record?
I mean, I don't want to say anything without looking at it, because the one thing that we didn't do, and it should be stressed, is we haven't followed this up with empirical analysis. It's something we really want to do, and we're kind of trying to keep our eyes out for an ideal data set for this, because it needs to be a really rich data set And there needs to be some logic behind the impact, light behind it being impacted by ecosystem engineers. But I mean, the results suggest that it's a possibility. Now, whether there's another, whether we do more runs later on and we come to the conclusion that actually this is very unlikely to manifest in the fossil record, that is very much a possibility. But the door is still open at the very least. These simulations didn't close the door.
Okay. So overall, were these results kind of what you expected? Were there any surprises, or did you learn anything from them?
I think the speciation and extinction dynamics were kind of what we expected. We thought with the way that we were modeling engineering in this sort of really abstract way, we would see some sort of response at the species level. Take looking at the trees that came out of TreeVoSim. But we were still really encouraged to see that. We were really excited to see that. The lack of a deterministic outcome was really nice to see, and was actually a little bit of a surprise. We kind of half expected to run the simulations and that our model of engineering to be too extreme or to confer too strong a fitness advantage, and that it would just result in engineers obliterating the competition consistently. And the fact that we didn't get that was a really nice surprise, and I guess gave us a bit of confidence that what we'd done might be useful, and might at least be able to serve as a foundation for future projects.
Hmm. Um, are there any limitations to your model? And something that I think you might have spoken about is that there is only a positive reinforcement of the to the ecosystem engineer. When it evolves, it's perfectly adapted. But if we think back to one of the examples that you gave earlier, which was during the Great Oxygenation Event, when those cyanobacteria were started photosynthesizing, they changed their environment, and to them, the oxygen was poisonous. So after a while, it's their waste product. It was not an environment that was good for them. After a while, it had a negative effect on that ecosystem engineer. Could you have that negative feedback, or even like less positive? Could that be introduced?
100%. I mean, the way that immediately springs to mind is that you could have the opposite of the engineer's genome introduced as a mask.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
that could be something that we could parameterize. Now, that might be really extreme, but you could use a portion of the genome. Maybe you overwrite part of one of the masks that define an environment with part of the genome of an engineer. So you increased its distance from the masks that are defining the fitness.
Mm,
So this system has loads and loads of limitations to its in terms of its applicability to empirical data, because it
yeah.
is so abstracted. It doesn't. The big one is its lack of a spatial component, and one thing we're hoping to do is to implement this kind of engineering model into TreeVoSim's big brother RevoSim, which does have a spatial component. It does actually consider a space, so that would be really exciting and a really nice sort of direction for us to take it. But I think there's the wonderful thing about this system is because it's so abstracted, you can really do whatever you want with it, and you can really customize it for any problem. And I think that makes it so exciting to work with, and also just really powerful. The way I sort of view simulations is they're never going to tell you the answer to a question, but they're going to cross out wrong answers. They're going to help you constrain the range of outcomes, constrain your possibilities until eventually you're left with a manageable list that maybe you can test with empirical data. And I think that's where setups like this, systems like this are best applied. They're good at constraining your focus and your efforts.
That is a beautiful answer to a surprise question at the end, which I was going to put to you,
Ah,
which is,
sorry.
like, what's the point? Like, it's not real, but it's a beautiful answer to that.
We could cut it. We could cut that and just chop it up.
It'd be seamless. Yeah. Something I also thought about during the course of this interview, which shows that I'm thinking and trying to talk and listen at the same time, juggling all of those
I'm
things.
impressed.
Is there any interconnectedness of the organisms that could come into play? Because they're all individual organisms within this simulation, but in real life, an ecosystem is a system. There's interconnectivity between each of the organisms. You lose one of those organisms, it might have knock-on effects, positive or negative, to the other organisms. But your model doesn't have that. Could that
No.
be introduced?
That would be a really interesting thing to introduce. It might be a bit difficult just because there
Hmm.
isn't it doesn't really have like a resource component to it. Revosim, everything is we just have this concept of fitness, so they kind of compete with each other because they're all ranked every iteration based on their fitness, and their probability of duplicating is they might not even get a chance to duplicate if they're too far down the list, because probability dictates that those earlier earlier individuals in the queue are going to get that chance first, and one of them's probably going to duplicate. Um, but it'd be a really interesting thing to play with. It's probably the kind of problem better suited to RevoSim, because with a concept of space, you could start, integrating concepts of resources. And I think RevoSim already has a few of that. I haven't actually explored the system too much beyond playing around with it. So I don't know the nitty gritty. But I think RevoSim would be a better environment for that kind of problem.
The idea that there is something out there that's more complicated than this scares me. I'm just going to cuddle my rocks after this and just be like, there. Don't worry. The data can't get you.
I think the best way I can sell RevoSim to you is you can use any pixel image as an environment, and the colors of the
What?
pixels will. So you can submit any image. I in a workshop a few months ago, I compared my face with that of my supervisor, Professor Aaron Sal, as an environment, and we saw which of our two faces sustained the highest level of diversity, and it was indeed her face. Her face was better at sustaining a higher equilibrium diversity than mine. So it's a great tool, and it's it is actually surprisingly intuitive to use. It's really well thought out. It's really well documented, as is the case, I think, with anything Russell Garwood and Mark Sutton produce, and Joe Keating, who we've already blamed for this podcast earlier on. It's a great bit of software, but you can use pictures. You can use what is the standing diversity of your face, Dave? Can you tell me?
Probably a lot. There's a lot of diversity, especially in this episode where it's been contorted into very confused and happy and shocked. And
I'm sorry.
so for instance, could you start getting pictures of islands or something of a coastline and use that as like the pixels and try and map it
Absolutely.
to, yeah, something like that. Wow, that's cool. I'm
It's
so
really
glad that
cool.
you're doing this and not me.
I'm trying to convert as many people as possible. We'll get you there one day, Dave. We'll get you there one day.
Yeah, good luck. Is there any maths involved in this? Because if there is, I'm
No, it's wonderful. It's just you put in your numbers for your mutation rate. You say how quickly do I want my organisms to mutate? How quickly do I want my environment to mutate? How many runs? How many iterations? You just put a bunch of numbers in and hit go, and you watch it. It actually visualizes the evolution of the environment and the individuals in it, which is really cool. So you get to watch the blotches appear, and you watch the individual, sort of the populations um, follow the boundaries, or like find and adhere to the boundaries of the different colored pixels in your image. It's a pretty nifty setup.
okay. Speaking of computer gaming, though, which is something that we did before this episode, and something that we do with Paleocast Gaming Network, a few of the games on there I have put off playing because they are hardcore evolutionary simulators. And the kind of thing that we've just described in this are kind of already exists in a way. You change variables,
Yeah.
trees are produced. You can add a new species. You can create an event that changes the ecosystem. These kinds of things sort of already exist, and sort of already exist in entertainment form. how would this be any different, or could something like that be used, or could you eventually end up with a way of like having that as a proper science backed simulation as opposed to a computer game? Have you seen these kinds of
I
things?
haven't seen. It's past as we were talking about before. I'm a very nostalgic gamer now, where I just long for the days where I could play my games, and I am. So these have passed me by. I haven't really had a chance to play any of them, but I I think the main thing is having control over your setup, and I suspect in with these sorts of games there are going to be certain variables that are kind of locked in and are part of it. But if these things were relaxed and you were given absolute control over a system, and you could define the rates with which certain events occur, and you could constrain those rates, then I mean, it there's as long as there are kind of there are biological concepts underpinning them, they could end up being informative one day, I guess. I haven't really thought about it. I think it's how many each of these simulators have assumptions baked into them, and it's about justifying those assumptions. And one of the reasons that we use TrevoSim so much, and one of the reasons we like TrevoSim, is because there are precious few assumptions baked in. There's this concept of fitness, and there's a concept of reproduction, and that we are happy relating to to the to the to the modern world and to the natural world. But I guess in these games, maybe there are additional leaps made that maybe are unfounded. But I've not played them, so I don't know. I don't know. You'll have to tell me.
Oh, conversely, could we change your simulation into a computer game?
Absolutely.
Ecosystem engineers, Peggy 3.
I mean, at least it's an original title. It's an original title.
Right. Okay. So, tangents aside, let's get back to this. Yeah. So, to conclude, is there anything that you can tell about the real world today or evolutionary events in the past from this? Is it too early? Is it a good first step?
I think it's a good first step. Now, I'm not. I don't think we can use our study to say we can categorically we should categorically be able to find evidence of events that take place, ecosystem engineering behaviors and ecosystem engineering events that take place at the individual level in the fossil record, because the time scale of our simulation isn't it's in iterations. It's not even in seconds or minutes. So we really need to do a lot more work on what timescale this actually matches up with, and whether that can be directly applied, or gives us a transferable insight to working with the fossil record. As I said earlier, I think what it does is it leaves the door open to the possibility that ecosystem engineering leaves a mark on the fossil record, and can leave a mark on the fossil record in a way that our analyses should be able to pick up. But that door may well close with further investigation.
Okay. And is this kind of simulation capable of doing wonderful things in the future as it evolves itself?
I think so. I think one thing that's been really heartening since we published this paper is how many people have just floated ideas to us when we bumped into, you know, PhD students and postdocs and professors at conferences. We've had, and I say I haven't mentioned Russell. We've mentioned Russell already, Russell Garwood, but my collaborators, Frankie Dunn and Luke Parry, without them, this study wouldn't even be possible. This was very much a collaborative effort, and all four of us pitched in, and it's honestly been one of my favorite projects that I've ever worked on. So that coming back to your original question, there's lots of different directions we can take it. We had someone approach us the other day discussing, the possibility of exploring whether an organism is a generalist or a specialist, how
Mm.
that impacts its likelihood of surviving. That's the kind of question that this sort of system can um, it can answer, and we're really looking forward to working with that person on this question. Um, so there's lots of different ways you could take it. Anything that needs a fitness concept probably can be tackled with TrevoSim.
And for anyone that is considering a future in computational paleontology, is there anything you could tell them to convince them that this is the right path? And are there any paths available to
Oh,
to students? Are the PhDs going in this that they could work with this kind of stuff with you?
absolutely. So I think University of Manchester with Russell Garwood is a really good place to look. So keep an eye on their websites, on his website, and Luke Parry, also at the University of Oxford. Collaborates a lot with Russell, works with these kind of softwares. He's another good person that you can work with. But there's there's many more people. I'm just naming my collaborators there, but there are a lot of people that are developing models of their own that are equally powerful and equally cool and can answer really fascinating questions. So I think it's just be open to it. They are daunting, these simulators, and this kind of work is kind of daunting. But once you get your head around them, they're really fun to play with, and they give you a skill set that you can apply to pretty much any group, which is what I really like about it. Where I've landed as a paleobiologist is I don't have expertise in any one group, and that does make me sad sometimes. I wish I had a group that I could talk as passionately about as some people can with theirs. But on the flip side, it means that I can ask questions about the evolutionary process that maybe I wouldn't be able to if I was confined to one particular study taxon. So it's a it's a broad field, and there's lots of different ways you can take it, but it gives you the option to do that, which is why I think simulations and computational paleobiology in general are a really fun and exciting place to be at the moment.
Is there any way that we can use this simulator to figure out what's going to happen with American football?
Ah, oh, that I mean, if only, if only I would sleep so much better if I could just put in, the how the first quarter of a game has gone. I'd be able to go to bed at a reasonable time on a Sunday night and just say, "Oh, I've seen the first quarter. I know the result. Let me just run it through the simulation." Oh, job good. But I think it's it's a problem too complex. And I mean that's why I enjoy it, but I think we're a bit of a way off there yet.
Yeah, I'm imagining the slow fade off in this conversation, just off into the distance. Just slowly reduce the volume, Dave.
Yeah.
This conversation will go on and on and on. This is a
It's
whole
just
new
like
podcast.
I was about to say, now we're on football analytics simulations, like day one of building a bit of simulation software for football. I mean, I would very, if anyone wants to give me funding for that, I'd be very happy to dedicate some time.
You need to get in with the gambling people. They would be all over that.
Oh my god, oh
Ugh.
my god, they'd either be all over it or they'd hate it, and you'd be public enemy number one
Yes, indeed.
as far as Betfair are concerned.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be very fair. So, Tom, thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Thanks for having me, Dave. I've had a lot of fun.
It's been great. I've learned a lot. I have struggled. I have understood. I have, been amazed by what is possible with software. So thanks for that.
I'm glad I was able to pull back the curtain and I don't know show you the light.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall with Liz Martin Silverstone, Tom Fletcher, Nick Lupsher, Emily Keeble, and Sophie Pollard. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, our listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll gain access to additional multimedia content, and thanks to everyone who's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs. And follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.